to reach out as we go, whether it's in the chat or if you feel like you want to unmute and share, that's fine too. I'm going to go ahead and confirm. Can you guys see my resume 101 slide?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. And then I always like lose everything. It's like the first time I've used Zoom when we've all been doing this for like 2 years. So I'll go ahead and get started. But yeah, thank you for joining. My name is Evelyn Ramos. I'm the Associate Director for the Career and Professional Development Center here at Stanislaus State. Today, the workshop's focusing on resumes, really. So very foundational. So I know a few of you likely have several years of experience, so I wouldn't expect your resume to be one page necessarily. But I think we'll go over just the foundation of a resume, right? What's the purpose of a resume? What is it about? What's its job? How do you know if it's working? So those are some of the things I'll be covering. My email's there. If you want to reach out to me at any point, feel free to connect. I'm happy to share resources as well after this session. So thanks again for joining. I'll go ahead and get started here. So just as mentioned, a few things I like to talk about. What's the purpose of the resume? I definitely go into more of like the formatting and the sections that we commonly recommend. Again, I don't think a resume is one size fits all. So you have to take what you feel is best for you and for the job you're trying to apply to at the time. I highlight some steps regarding writing a relevant resume. I'll speak briefly about the curriculum vitae versus a resume and the differences there. And then I'll talk a little bit about cover letters. I know this is a resume workshop. Typically, I like to encourage folks to always include a cover letter unless the employer doesn't want a cover letter. And I have seen some jobs explicitly say, do not send me a cover letter. You always want to do what's on the job description. But I did want to talk about them a little bit because folks don't always have one of those when they come in and meet with me. So just to give some quick tips there. And again, just to note, so if you are joining as a staff member from off campus, I assume you've registered via Zoom. If you want to just be double sure, send me your work email address in the chat, and I will just make sure that I send that over to HR, as well as if you are a student seeking class credit for this assignment or whatnot, just let me know and I'll do what you need me to do via email. It's eramos23@CSU.Stan. So the purpose of a resume, really we know it as, we need a resume when we apply for jobs. But really, if you think about it, the resume, what it's doing is it's showing your relevant experience. So that's the key word. It's relevant experience. It's not showing all of your experience. It's your relevant experience. It supports you as a candidate for either a job, graduate school admission, a scholarship, a promotion, etc. There's usually a purpose, a point that you're writing this resume for. It also showcases your ability to apply your skills and experiences to the position you're seeking in this future, right? So typically we use a resume to get us towards something new. It may not be different necessarily, but something else. It basically tells your story in a succinct and relevant way. I think relevant is a key word. Your resume should be relevant to what you're trying to do. And resumes don't get you hired, they get you an interview. So I often tell students, your resume is working if you're getting phone calls. I've had students reach out and say, I've been applying to hundreds of jobs. It's been a few months now and I'm not getting any calls. The resume, the first thing I look at is the resume. Is the resume telling your story? Is it saying what you want it to say? So it's not meant to get you the job outright, right? So you should still think about the interview and whatnot, but the resume ideally will meet that screening criteria, will be sent over to the committee, etc. So just some things that you can do to try and make sure it gets past the screening is to think about your sections in the resume. Like, how am I going to format this? What should I share on my resume? Typically what we recommend is that a resume is 1 to 2 pages. Again, that just depends on your level of experience, what you're trying to share, right? So again, if you're someone with several years of experience, I don't want to say you have to have one page, right? Now, if you're someone with several years of experience and you're looking to get into something completely different, then you might want to consider a one page. So we can talk about that for sure. But ideally, we recommend a 10 to 12 font size, typically Calibri, Arial. Like I wouldn't do a Times Roman and 10, so definitely try to gauge. But keep in mind, folks need to be able to see the letters and want to read it. Address, I don't typically list address on a resume. It's definitely optional. However, I feel that a lot of resumes are posted online nowadays, not just specifically to jobs, but they might be posted on like LinkedIn or other professional association groups. So because that's public, I would encourage you not to post your home address on something that's going public like that. Typically, the job that you apply to will ask you for your address on an application. So it doesn't necessarily need to take up space on the resume. All I recommend including on the resume up at the top is your name, your email, a phone number, and your LinkedIn URL if you have one. The resume should be clean, easy to read, easy to scan. We recommend using bullet points, things to avoid, things like full sentences, charts, graphics, too much color or a lot of color, definitely avoiding any pictures of yourself, as well as using the absent first. So you want to be using absent first person. So instead of using I, me, or my, you would just start with the action word. And I'll show you guys an example of that. But I think as you're building your resume, it's definitely okay to write full sentences and write your whole story out. That's what I tell students, I recommend the students do. However, before you submit a resume, you should tailor it to really be easy and quick to read. And typically that's using phrases that start with action words versus full sentences or like blocks of paragraphs of text. You don't want to do that. You want to consider that most recruiters will only scan a resume potentially 6 to 8 seconds while they decide if they're going to keep reading it, right? So it's not that they have to read the whole thing in 6 to 8 seconds, but it's like us with a commercial, right? If it doesn't capture us in the first few seconds, we're not going to be paying attention. Similar with someone reading a resume. If it doesn't capture my attention in the first few seconds, I'm not going to read it. And that's one of the reasons we recommend avoiding templates. So Word has a lot of great templates. Google has a lot of great templates. You can find a lot of great templates online. Some are a little easier to follow and manipulate than others. I try to stay away from them simply because they tend to take up a lot of space with things that are not necessarily critical to have. So like, it's small here, but like there's a large block of text at the top. Not text. There's like a large block of color at the top. There's some columns that have a lot of empty white space. So templates make it really hard to manipulate the space and provide the content. If you want to add any more content, sometimes they're tougher to manipulate. And so some great questions in the chat. I'll go ahead and talk about those. Would you recommend having a professional summary on the resume? I think it definitely depends on your years of experience and what you're trying to highlight. So for example, mine has a summary of qualifications up at the top, and it has like maybe 4 bullets of like top skills that I wanted to highlight for a certain position. But I have, 15 plus years of experience. So I wouldn't necessarily use a summary of qualifications or a professional summary if you're someone that recently graduated, unless of course you've had years of experience in a certain field or industry. So it really just depends on the number of years you have, I believe, as well as, or even just the experience. Maybe it's a few years, but you've gone through a lot. You could definitely highlight that in the professional summary if you choose. I think that also should depend on the kind of job you're applying to, right? Because if you have a professional summary at the top and you're applying for like an entry-level customer service, that might seem a little intimidating and a little overqualified based, from a recruiter's perspective. They might think, oh, they have too much experience already. So you want to avoid, I think, being overqualified and underqualified at the same time. And so I typically see more of a professional summary with folks who have had several years of experience, potentially in a job not related to where they want to go now, but they still want to highlight some of those soft skills. The second thing, objective at the top. So I'll go into the specific sections of a resume in a bit too. I usually recommend an objective at the top. Again, more for folks who know specifically what job they're applying to. So for example, if you're applying for an accounting representative with the university, I would say seeking the accounting representative position with Stanislaus State. So the formula is basically seeking X position with Y company. So when it's, I'm sorry, just gotta. So yeah, when it's a position that you're familiar with, this is a position you're interested in, it can be helpful to have an objective. In my time working in career, I feel like I've started to kind of balance in the middle. It just depends if you need an objective or not. I like the objective personally because as a reader, it helps me start to picture and understand the kind of skills that you're going to be talking to me about, right? So ultimately your content should support your objective as well. And I'll go into that a little bit further into the slides as well. So I recommend not using templates also because some organizations utilize things called applicant tracking systems. So it's basically computers are reading your resume or, artificial intelligence to read your resume to see how closely it matches a position description. So if a company receives thousands of resumes for one job or two jobs, right, they can't afford to look through all of those in an efficient amount of time. So likely they'll run the resumes through this program. The program then says, oh, only 40% of these 1,000 resumes met our qualification threshold of like 50%, and they were using the language that you told me to look for. So that's the trouble with that is when a person is reading the resume or scanning, sometimes they'll make assessments or assumptions about your experience, and that may help you get to the committee. That's not always the case. But if we're thinking about AI, there's not necessarily any of that intuition or understanding. It's just looking for what it was told to look for. So you want to avoid any kinds of resume formats that might throw off that system or that might not really work in your favor. So if a company does use an applicant tracking system, I highly encourage you to use a simple, straightforward format. Not a lot of fancy templates, no columns because the machine might get, or, the software might not be able to read in a column format. And I encourage you to use keywords because that's likely what it's been trained to look for. And I'll give a quick highlight about how to find keywords in a job description. And I apologize, it's blurry. I definitely do not intend for you to read all of the content on here. But I wanted to share a general format that we typically recommend. So I recommend a chronological format. I do find that it's the most commonly used because employers like to know what have you been doing recently. So you would list the information in reverse chronological order. So present, what you're doing now, to past, what you have done before. Ideally, you should still keep in mind that you want the most relevant information up higher on the resume versus lower. So in this example, you notice there's an objective and there's education, and then it goes into experience. So if you're applying for a job that requires a bachelor's degree and you're either getting that soon or you have one, I would list the education up higher because then the reader can quickly identify they've met that minimum requirement. Now, if it's a position that relies more heavily on the experience than on education, I would probably reverse that and put experience up higher than education. So really you want to consider what is going to capture the reader. What are they looking for? And I find that the chronological format makes that a little bit easier for folks. So there are other formats that you may have heard of. There's functional, which is more skills-based. Typically what we'll see is, a similar format with name, email, phone number, but then it might go into sections like communication skills, These are things I've done to highlight my communication skills. Someone that has large gaps in employment may want to do this. I don't necessarily recommend a functional resume for someone that's just gotten out of school, or someone that's applying for a more or a less experienced position. Even if you have some gaps in your experience, especially if you're a student, you might not have been working for a while, right? And that's definitely okay. I don't feel like employers, I do feel that employers look at your time in college as some experience. So I wouldn't undersell that. But then there's a combination resume too. So you might give, you might indicate where you've gotten some experiences, but there may also be more of a focus on those functional, like here are my leadership skills, here are my communication skills. Again, ultimately, you want to pick a format that is true to who you are and showcases you in the best light. We're just sharing some different ideas as to things you can use. But it's important to understand what is the job looking for and think about, is it reflected obviously on my resume? You never want to assume that a reader will make assumptions for you, because they will not. They will only look for things that they're looking for, and you know what they're looking for based on the description. So it's our job to show them, hey, you're looking for XYZ, here's XYZ, right? Don't make them look for things for too long. Because again, you can't control what they read. So it's important to control it as much as you can anyway. So possible sections on a resume, so objective, definitely always encourage education, whether you just graduated high school, you got a GED, you did some community college classes, you're currently in a degree program, especially if you graduated already, the employer wants to know what programs did you do and when did you complete them, right? Because that kind of shows the recency of your experience in an academic setting. If you are someone that's graduating soon and you don't have much experience in the field that you want to go into, you may want to consider adding your coursework, because that's likely where you've gotten more of your experience as it relates to the field you're potentially considering. You could also add projects, whether that's class projects, community service, hobbies you might have that are pretty extensive. And then you want to have an experience section. And experience can be paid or unpaid. It doesn't only have to be formal, professional, paid experience. Also, if you're graduating soon and you don't have a lot of lived professional work experience, employers understand that your experience is likely from your coursework, or from a student job, or from volunteering in a class, right? So don't undersell your unpaid experiences. I mean, definitely list paid experiences as well, but consider that experience itself doesn't only refer to paid professional experience. Skills, always want to have a skills section, but make sure it's brief, right? You don't want to include a lot of soft skills in this skills section. So things like, oh, and I'm sorry, I think I'm getting too much into it here. So I'll cover each a little bit here. So objective, again, it's optional, typically goes at the top. If you notice at the top, I have my name, so Wendy Warrior, my phone number, my email, and my LinkedIn URL. So if you are on LinkedIn, you can actually, and you want folks to go to your LinkedIn account, you can put that on your resume. If you're not quite sure about LinkedIn, students can actually connect with us to talk about LinkedIn and develop their LinkedIn account. Also, Stan State alumni. If you're an alum from another college, I highly encourage you to check out your Career Center and see if you can utilize those services there. But the objective would be at the top. An objective is brief, it's not long, so it's not a professional summary, but it's really seeking exposition with why company. Again, here, some of you may use a summary of qualifications if you have more experience, or if you want to highlight specific skills. If you do use more of a summary of qualifications, I would suggest maybe no more than like 3 to 5 bullets, depending on the position itself. So education typically goes next. I work with a lot of current students and recent grads. If you're someone that graduated a while ago and your experience is more relevant then your education, you would probably put your experience next. But this is just a way to showcase your education. You always want to list the university or the institution. The major, you always want to list Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science. The program itself, psychology, business, criminal justice, and your graduation semester. So May 21, spring 21, fall 21, however you want to show it, but you want to show the timeline. You can also add honors if you had honors in the programs. If you had a minor, you can list that as well. And then relevant coursework this is typically where I list relevant coursework if most of my experience comes from the classes. And if you notice, it's only the names of the classes, is not like the number or anything like that. And I don't go into detail about the classes there. In the experience is where I would go into detail, right? So if you notice, the blue box is smaller. So basically that just means the largest section really on your resume is going to be the experience. And again, this can be part-time jobs, internships, projects, research, clubs, organizations. If you built your own computers or you have your own, side business or anything that showcases your skills like communication, teamwork, organization, money management. It doesn't, again, have to only be paid work experience. And then I always encourage that you use action words to begin each bullet. I highly encourage folks to just write out your experience. Don't worry about getting it into a perfect format the first time you're writing your resume. It's like an essay, right? You don't just write, unless you're a procrastinator like myself, you don't just write a resume in a day and send it away, right? Typically it'll take some time, get your ideas on paper, review it, edit, finalize it, right? It's okay to do that. Don't feel like you have to have the resume in this exact format right away because we don't think in phrases. So to get it in a phrased format like this can be a challenge. I typically encourage students, just write out your story, tell me what you did. I'll type out what they're saying word for word, and then we go through and make it into a more bulleted format. But if you notice on this resume, some are from classroom projects, some are from a student organization they were in. There really is only one job there, which was paid job, which is a writing tutor. Everything else is either a classroom assignment or a student leadership experience. So again, just keep in mind that experience can be paid or unpaid. It doesn't only have to be paid professional setting. And then the last section is the skills section, just to demonstrate how I recommend and the skills that I recommend listing. So you want to avoid, again, communication skills, time management, budgeting. Those are skills that should be demonstrated within your experience. So consider adding that soft skill to the bullets within the experiences. So you're actually showing where you got those skills. You're not just saying you have the skills, you're showing where you applied them. Especially if anyone's bilingual. Sometimes I never see any languages on the resume, and then people tell me they're bilingual and that they always use the language. That should be on the resume. So think about, you could add your language to the skills section, but then consider, do I use my language skills in any of my experiences? And if that's the case, add that to one of the bullets, because then it shows the reader, okay, they're bilingual. I can see what environments they've used this language in. And that goes for things like Word, Excel, PowerPoint. If you have Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Zoom on your resume, try to think about how you can demonstrate you've used that skill within an experience section. For those of you that are within the science fields, if you're looking for lab opportunities or research opportunities, consider what you've done in your labs in the classes, right? What can I talk about that I learned in my labs? And sometimes we think this is obvious that I've done these things. But again, readers are not going to make assumptions for you. You need to tell them what you know, because they will not make assumptions, and you don't want to miss getting a phone call because you weren't very obvious with the skills that you had. So how to write a relevant resume. So I always encourage folks to have 2 resumes. One that's a master resume, one that just has everything. You're not worried about tailoring it for one specific job. You're just getting things out of your head and onto paper, which is usually the hardest part. So you want to indicate any classes you took, projects you worked on, volunteer work, community work, side jobs, anything that you would want to, show that'll indicate a skill. But you don't apply with that resume by any means. Do not apply with the 5-page resume unless the job recalls for it, right? But now you want to look at positions of interest. What kind of job do you want? Go through that job description, highlight key skills that they're asking for. Now go to your resume and say, how can I make this a 1-page resume that focuses on the skills they're asking for only? That doesn't mean you ignore everything else you've ever done and you never talk about it again. It just means that for the resume, to get their attention, you're only going to talk about the things that they've asked you to showcase and demonstrate. Typically, that's enough to fill a page. If it's not, we can go through that later. But I think that the idea is that your resume should, again, reflect skills relevant to the job that the recruiter is going to want to see. So we usually call this tailoring your resume. And I just like this picture of a tailor because it's the same idea, right? Usually when you want something to fit you well, you might take it to a tailor who will then take your measurements and say, make the changes that need to be made for you to feel well and look well in that outfit, right? The same for your resume. You need to be able to show that you have paid attention to what the skills are that they're asking for, and that you've taken the time to show them, this is the skill, these are the skills that I have, and this is how it's relevant for you. So basically, tailoring the resume means you're measuring the job description, look at what keywords stand out, how can you show that you have experience that fits what they're asking for. If they don't have a description that's very thorough, I suggest looking at the company. What's their mission? What's their vision? What do they talk about? What's their company culture? Is there something in your experience that you can highlight that would show them you have an understanding of who they are and what they're trying to do? So here's an example of identifying key skills. So I just did a quick copy paste of a job here that they prefer experience somebody that's bilingual. I should have put an arrow on that. That's definitely something that you want. If you're bilingual, you want to make sure that's on your resume and that is very obvious. If so, the work in itself, you'd be providing direct care to patients. You'd be evaluating care to patients with medical follow-up, perform limited minor surgeries. So if you're graduating soon, you may not have performed minor surgeries, but if you are in a major that has required you to be in a lab, you've likely had to perform some kind of lab procedure that indicated you understood about safety, etc. Right? So you want to think about, what have I done where I can show that I have these skills? It doesn't have to be the exact same environment, but where have I used these soft skills? And then that's what you want to show on your resume. So if you took any classes where you learned about diabetes and hypertension as it relates to this job here, you could list that class, right? Or you could list the assignment where you had to maybe do research and do a presentation. Ideally, you'll want to post assignments that you did well on. You never necessarily want to list anything on your resume that you didn't do well in, or that you might have to speak negatively about. Assume they're going to ask you about everything on your resume. I've met with students that say, I really hated this job. That's why I was only there for a month. That's okay, but don't put it on the resume. If you don't want to talk about it and you don't want to be asked about it, don't put it on the resume. It's okay if you have a month gap on your resume. That's not a long time. So yeah, just think about that. You don't have to list everything you've ever done on your resume. So what I mentioned here is start accomplishment statements with strong action verbs. Basically, the accomplishment statements are the bullets that you list under your experience. I do say you want to avoid using responsible for or experienced in. It's okay to start with that language. Again, write your draft. Responsible for calling patients every day. What I would do is just take out responsible for and start with call patients every day to remind them of their appointments, right? So you're starting with an action word. It's okay to use this language as you're starting out. Again, it's a draft. But then you could use more active words, more engaging words like I led, researched, marketed. Think about what you're trying to show on your resume and the skills that are related to the job. You could always use keywords from the job description on your resume as well. Now, don't copy and paste from the resume, from the job description to the resume by any means, but take a look at their language. What are some of the verbs they're using? How do they want to know, or like, how do they want to see skills on your resume? Because you could potentially use some of that language. And then you want to demonstrate your experience. So you want to show how you have the experience that you say you have. So if I say I'm a team player, it's more effective if I say I collaborated with a team of so many people. Or if I say I'm results oriented, what results did I get, right? So I developed and executed an event with over 100 participants. So it's helpful to quantify your results, to show again the size of groups maybe you're able to work with, or the projects you're able to manage at a time, or the budgets. If you are someone that works with budgets, how large is this budget? Was it a grant? Did you have to ensure payroll was on time? For how many people? It's helpful to list those things. And then that's what I have for resume. But if there's any questions on resume, definitely feel free to send them in the chat and I can review a little bit further. But I just have a few slides here on cover letter. I think it's just 2. But really the cover letter brings your skills and experiences to life, and it shows your interest in that company or the position. So it does not reiterate your resume. So it should not just repeat your resume. They have your resume. I think what they want to see is why are you interested in this role? How do you see yourself making a change or a contribution here? If you're someone that's going into something completely different, this could be where you address that and where you show your interest in this new opportunity. I always recommend a cover letter. I see it as additional real estate in a way for you to promote yourself and for you to show that you have an understanding of what they're looking for. I also recommend that it's 1 page. I don't think a cover letter will make or break your application necessarily, but if they give you an option to submit one, I always err on the side of submitting one. Just make sure, right, you look for typos and that you don't submit the wrong cover letter to the wrong company, because that could be bad. But the idea is you want to show your interest. So I typically start with the first paragraph, maybe 1 or 2 sentences long. I'm applying for this position that I saw on your website. I feel like I'm a strong candidate. The next paragraph, this is why I'm interested, or kind of a summary of my skills and how it relates to this position. And then the last paragraph is easy. It's just a thank you for your time. I look forward to connecting. So it's not really meant to be anything super complicated. It does give them an example of your communication style and your writing skills. So again, you want to make sure you don't have a lot of typos or errors necessarily. But I do see it as an extra way to market your skills. So for students at Stanislaus State or alumni, we do offer resume review services. So if you want to bring in your resume or your cover letter, you can come in during these times without an appointment. So usually the mornings of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You could also make an appointment through Higher Stan State, also known as Handshake. Or you can just reach out to me via email if you'd like to connect at any point. And if you're an alum from another campus, again, I would reach out because they likely offer career-related services. I'm assuming for free or at a lower cost than if you were to go to like a private career counselor or career coach. And I did mention a little bit about a CV versus a resume. So depending on the kinds of jobs you're applying to, like if you're applying for teaching or education related jobs or administrative roles within education or higher ed, you'll likely be asked for a curriculum vitae instead of a resume. Sometimes the language is interchangeable. They'll say, give me a CV. A resume is sufficient as well. It just depends on what you want to showcase. So a resume, which is what we've been talking about, really highlights specific experiences as it relates to the job. It typically lists an objective. You don't include references there or names of like professional associations or articles you've published, things like that. Typically, it's only relevant to list experiences within the last 10 years. Whereas a curriculum vitae or a vita typically highlights academic accomplishments, more like scholarly research. It may include references or names of faculty or professionals you've worked with before. If you've hosted any presentations at conferences, you would likely include that in a CV. If you're applying for graduate school soon, they may ask for a CV. And I think at that point, it'd be relevant to use a CV where you talk about maybe your research that you did and how it's relevant to graduate school. For a vita, there really isn't typically a page limit that I've heard of, but I do believe it's still relevant that you want to keep it specific to the opportunities you're looking for. I don't think anybody wants to look at content that's not relevant to the position. So still, it says 2 to 10 pages typically. I wouldn't necessarily give 10 pages just to give 10 pages. You want to be intentional about the material you're sharing. Just some reminders. So if you want to email me your name and your preferred email to use if you need verification for a class. If you're doing this for the cross-campus collaboration, you likely already registered via Zoom, so I'll have your email, but feel free to message me in the chat as well if you want to just be sure. Then I'll get that information over to our coordinators. Remember that a resume doesn't get you a job necessarily, right? They help you get an interview. So that's why it's important to show your relevant skills on a resume. Do not assume that, again, people will see that you have lots of years of experience and they'll try to put you in a job that fits for you, because that's not the case. It may have been at some point, but not anymore. So STAN students and alumni, get your resume critiqued with us for free. Also, if you're a STAN State alum or student, sign up on Hire STAN State to post your edited resume. If you guys have any questions, definitely feel free to unmute. I'm going to stop sharing and I'll stop recording. But that's what I have for you guys. Let me stop recording.